Thank you very much, Deputy President, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to put some remarks on the record today in relation to the Housing Australia Future Fund and in relation to the justification for the Coalition putting forward legislation later today that will put particular guardrails around the operation of the Housing Australia Future Fund. Now, you would have to be basically not living in Australia over the last month or two if you were not aware of the enormous scandal engulfing the CFMEU and the unions and the Labor Party more broadly. Now, in relation to the CFMEU, the government has now claimed that it's shocked about all this corruption and disgusting behaviour, which everyone knew about, but taking them on face value, they say that they are shocked, and as a result of their shock, they are now seeking to put the CFMEU into administration. So CFMEU goes into administration as a result of legislation passed by this parliament, but the government shows no interest in the CFMEU's best friends who are operating a superannuation fund called Cbus. Now, the Cbus super fund has 3 CFMEU trustees on its board, and the Cbus superannuation fund is a significant donor and payer of funds to the CFMEU. Now, the Housing Australia Future Fund is seeking to engage with institutional investors to build houses in Australia. That is its stated objective. One superannuation fund has said that it would like to work with the Housing Australia Future Fund, and that fund is Cbus, the CFMEU's fund. Now, this fund is chaired by Mr Wayne Swan, who was a former Treasurer of the Commonwealth and is currently the President of the Labor Party. And Mr Swan, according to the Cbus website, is not the Chief Investment Officer of Cbus. He is the President of the Labor Party and the Chairman of the fund. But in his role as the Chair of the fund, Mr Swan has said, and I quote, "We believe that investing through the HAFF," by that he means the Housing Australia Future Fund, "will meet the best financial interests of our members." So Mr Swan has committed $500 million of retirement savings belonging to members of the Cbus fund so he can co-invest with the Housing Australia Future Fund. Now, we think that that is a massive red flag, because if it's good enough to put the CFMEU into administration, then why on earth would we leave taxpayers exposed to the CFMEU's activities through Cbus? Why would we do that? We will not do that. We will move to protect taxpayer funds by legislating that the Housing Australia Future Fund cannot do business with an organisation like Cbus, which is run by the CFMEU. It is not an appropriate party for the government, for the Commonwealth, to do business. Now, we've been trying to get to the bottom of these matters, and recently we filed a Freedom of Information request to try and work out what has happened between the Cbus Super Fund and the Housing Australia Future Fund. What correspondence has occurred between November 2022 and 19 July 2024? That FOI was rejected by this government, a government which promised it would be transparent and honest. And to make matters worse, we also passed an order for production of documents through the Senate last week with unanimous support, which was due yesterday, which has not been complied with. So there is secret correspondence between the Housing Australia Future Fund and the Cbus Fund, which should be made known to the public, particularly given the scandal. And as I say, if it's good enough to put the CFMEU into administration, then surely it's good enough to protect taxpayer funds in the Housing Australia Future Fund from the corruption and thuggery of this union. Now, in relation to this particular super fund, it has, as I say, 3 CFMEU trustees on its board. One of them has been on the board for 13 years, Ms Rita Malia, and there's a Mr David Noonan who's been on the board for 16.5 years. Now, the APRA guidelines say you can only be on the board for 12 years, so 16.5 years. Sometimes I wonder whether we're in Australia or whether we might be in Argentina. Now, in relation to the broader issue of the coalition between the CFMEU and the Cbus Fund, it has paid $2.5 million in the last year from the Cbus fund to the CFMEU, and it has established a Cbus property organisation which has done $6 billion worth of property work since 2006. Now, what is very curious here is that we've talked at length about the CFMEU's 30% tax on the Australian people, where if you want to build an apartment building, you have to pay 30% in grafts to the CFMEU. But interestingly, the CFMEU and Cbus have been exempting their own developments from this tax, and during an ETU strike which has occurred in Sydney in relation to Endeavour Energy since February this year, the ETU, which has a seat on Cbus's board, has exempted Cbus property from their actions. So they are trying to destroy private construction but exempt their own vested interest here from their 30% tax and their 20% cut in productivity. Productivity in the building industry is in the toilet because of the CFMEU, and all you have to do is read some of the accounts from the developers, like Mr Disawadi Masadamo, who says that there are guys on site enforcing no ticket, no start type arrangements, which means if you're not in the union, you don't get to work on site. On large sites, there may be anywhere between 5 and 10 of these guys walking around, and that's a cost that gets built into the system, and it's a significant cost. So that is the cost that we're all paying. Now, in relation to the CFMEU and its engagement in my own state in New South Wales, there's another case which has come up recently, which is the Hakoah case, where the Hakoah Jewish Club has been developing a site in East Sydney. It has a developer called Parkview. There's been a dispute there. Hakoah alleges there's been a sweetheart deal between Parkview and some subbies, where the subbies make payments off the books to the CFMEU, and then when Hakoah and Parkview have had a dispute, the CFMEU has been able to threaten to get pro-Palestinian activists to go down to this Hakoah development and threaten the Hakoah members and associates in order to get the best possible deal in their industrial dispute with Hakoah. So they are putting the fear of a pro-Palestinian militant campaign into a Jewish area, a Jewish club, which shows the length these people will go. So I think it's very important that we're clear-eyed about what we're trying to achieve with this legislation to be introduced today by the Coalition. This is about preserving the integrity and probity of taxpayer funds. Now, it is true that we don't believe that the Housing Australia Future Fund is a good idea. We don't think that spending billions of dollars on housing bureaucracies which build no houses and to spend money on executives and paper pushing is a good idea. But because there is $10 billion of taxpayer funds invested in this organisation, we must do everything we can to protect these taxpayer funds against it being pillaged by the CFMEU and its Cbus constituent fund. If it was allowed to go ahead, that the Cbus fund could in fact co-invest with the Housing Australia Future Fund, you would see a massive exposure of taxpayer funds to criminal elements who are deliberately inflating the costs of construction. And perhaps the irony is not lost on the chamber, that the government is seeking help from the CFMEU and Cbus, who are the same organisations that are making housing unaffordable in Australia. These are the people, through their disgusting corruption, are inflating the building costs in this country, which is meaning that young people can't afford to buy an entry-level apartment. So the idea that we would allow taxpayer funds to be exposed through the Housing Australia Future Fund to the Cbus fund cannot stand, which is why our legislation will ban the Housing Australia Future Fund from investing in any project or any consortium which is engaged with Cbus for the period in which the CFMEU is in administration. Because if it's good enough to put the CFMEU into administration, it's surely good enough to protect taxpayer funds from being pillaged by the same criminal and corrupt elements. I look forward to introducing that bill later today.